Thank you. I'm so honored to be here today, especially in such a lovely spot and such a distinguished lecture series. I have to say you've chosen well before, and I hope not to disgrace the growing success of this series. Having heard Renee speak so eloquently about 1812, I'm embarrassed to say that I'm going to skip another sort of 14 or so years and talk to start about 1826, so 14 years later. And that's a very important year for the history of Freemasonry in America. It is for Americans themselves very significant. It is the 50th anniversary of American independence. Famously, July 4th, 1826, you have the death of two of the key figures of that famous day, July 4th, 1776. On July 4th, 1826, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died. And this year, this whole process helps to encourage a new interest in the Revolution, helps people to think about things. And this is an important year for Masons as well. Masons had just in the previous couple of years almost played host to the man known as the nation's guest, the Marquis de Lafayette, the French aristocrat who had come over to America to fight for American independence and who had become virtually a surrogate son to George Washington, appears in America from 1824 to 1825 and virtually everywhere. It's Masons, Masonic bodies who welcome Lafayette, who bring him into their lodges, who hold ceremonies for him. And this happens both in Buffalo and in Rochester. And this sort of in some ways sets off and culminates a period of unmatched prosperity for Freemasons. And you can get some sense of this in an article in a Batavia newspaper. Batavia is a small town in between Rochester and Buffalo. And on September 1st, he writes to the local newspaper about Freemasonry, suggesting that the fraternity has pervaded almost every portion of the habitable globe and extended its salutary influence to the distressed in every clime. True, he admitted, Masonry has had some embarrassments, but it's not surprising, he said, in an institution which is almost coeval with time and coextensive with the habitations of our race, an institution that has had her Washingtons, her Franklins, and her hosts of patriots and sages. So it's not surprising that there's some people who are exceptions to this kind of rule, but it should rather excite our wonder that it has shed so many brilliant rays amid surrounding gloom, that it has so often cheered the poor and weary pilgrim traveling from afar, that distress never entered its portals or was driven penniless away. So this kind of extraordinarily high praise of Freemasonry, which is everywhere in America in the sort of 50 years between 1776 and 1826. But the reason I picked 1826 is not just for these high moments, but it's also because 1826 also marks a turning point in that period of prosperity. Because less than 2 weeks after Henry Brown published that article in that newspaper in Batavia, New York, in that very same town, about 2 weeks later, an event happened which would upend that period of prosperity. And that date is almost as resonant in today's culture as July 4th, because that day was September 11th. September 11th, 1826. And what had happened in Batavia was that for the previous few months, a local bricklayer, almost a mason, in some ways, but a Mason fraternally as well. He had decided that he was going to publish a book containing Masonic rituals, allowing them open to anyone who would buy those books. And members in the area, all throughout upstate New York, in fact, all throughout the area, became increasingly concerned about that work. They were worried about the exposure of these rituals. And I'm sad to say, especially in the Masonic group, as you probably know, Masons made a number of attempts to try to deal with that, which in some ways acting unofficially and without sort of official sanction, went to all sorts of lengths to try to stop that. They attempt to arrest Morgan. They attempt to get those papers away from him. On September 10th, they go so far as attempting to burn down the printing office that at that point seems to have been in the process of publishing Morgan's book. And on September 11th, Morgan is arrested on a trivial charge and is taken to Canandaigua, miles and miles off to the east. And the next day, he is released, but then charged with another debt, then released into the custody of Masons, of a group of Masons, who then drove him more than 100 miles to Fort Niagara, where he was held. And I'm going to show you a couple of slides. This is some of the advantage of coming here early. This is Morgan himself as he appears on a monument in Batavia. I'll show you more about that. But this is him on top of this large column. This is according to local lore. This is the place on the street where Morgan was arrested in Batavia. The last time he was sort of seen as a free man. He was then driven. This is Fort Niagara from the side. I arrived too late in order to go in to see things. So this is the best you can get. I apologize. And then this is the Niagara River right nearby, where according to anti-Masons, according to a number of people, this is where he was taken and perhaps drowned. And I'll explain more about how this all happens, but I wanted to give you a little more introduction to that so that we can then talk about the earlier experience and why it is that this moment, this first September 11th, is so important in the history of Freemasonry. Because that first September 11th was not, as it was in 2001, not an explosion which is visible throughout the country, almost in real time. You can watch it on TV and even on the internet. It was not something which many people died, not nearly 3,000, but a relatively insignificant man in a small town in upstate New York. But this first September 11th, this 1826 event, eventually became what might arguably be called the most famous abduction in pre-Civil War America. And like 2001, it was an earth-shaking event. As Henry Brown, the man who you just heard celebrating Freemasonry on September 1st, recognized that September 11th event was an explosion which has been heard around the globe. And it suggested this is the end of a major period of American Masonic experience, the end of a period of the fraternity's first major expansion in America. I've even come to speak of this as the first golden age of American Freemasonry. Because as you know, in 1826 marks the beginning of a period of distress for the fraternity, but it rises again in the late 19th century and up through the 20th century in a period that has been called the golden age of American fraternalism, and then continues to grow in the 1840s to the 1860s. But this 1826 change here is in some ways the start of a transformation in American public life as well, a change in politics, in religion, and civil societies. So I think it's well worth us going back to talk about that first golden age and how it changed. Now, to distinguish these two September 11ths, I think we need to notice two things. First of all, that if 2001 marked a period of enormous fear about people from the outside, about outside enemies coming in to destroy society, 1826 marked a series of enormous fears about people who were attempting to destroy society from within. A series of subversives working inside, and people who were not just marginal, people on the outside, people on the edges of things, but neighbors and leaders, people who had been before deeply respected for things. So that's the sort of internal psychological geography. There's also a physical geography, which is different as well. In both 1776 and 1826, it was the big cities which were the center of those events. Philadelphia, the Declaration of Independence, would become the capital of a new nation at that point. New York City in 2001 was the site of the World Trade Center, a building that had been two buildings, which had included the world's tallest building. One was erected. But the 1826 event occurred in upstate New York in a very small town. And I'm going to argue to you today that it's no accident that it was upstate New York, which was sort of the epicenter of that change. The upstate New York had been the center of American expansion, of American Masonic expansion in the half century after independence. A center which helped to create these changes, which helped to develop the ideas, the expressions, all sorts of things which had made that world so different. So, I want to talk to you now just a little bit about the growth of Freemasonry. By 1826, Masonry had existed as a fraternity for just a little over a century, about 110 years at least, and had existed in America for almost a century. Arriving in America about 1730, this early Masonry had been of relatively little importance for about half of that time. Masonry arriving in the 1730s in the large cities of the American colonies had been of relatively limited social range and geographical reach. And this is not an American Freemason, but this is an English portrait, which I think helps to show some of the significance of these early Freemasons. A man, you can see, who's enormously well-dressed, beautifully coiffured, with a lovely wig, looks as if he shaved his head. He is standing in that very elegant 18th century position, showing off his legs there very nicely with that turn there, holding his hand within his shirt, which we later associate with Napoleon, but was actually an 18th century pose, and a sign, both of those, the legs, the hand, a sign of sort of relaxed gentility, not sort of the ramrod military straightness, but the ideal of a gentleman who was confident within himself and willing to listen to other people. Now, Masonry after the American Revolution begins to change. It begins to grow dramatically, faster than a population, which is expanding even further, and it's New York, which is in many ways one of the great centers of that development. In fact, it's New York, which in some ways goes through dramatic sorts of changes themselves. This is a map from 1796, which in some ways suggests the way in which that state was in many ways sort of a second-rate kind of place. 1790, New York had fewer people than either Massachusetts or North Carolina. And you can see this map, I think it's much larger here. You can see as you go to the west of Albany, you can see how many of those towns are beginning to be laid out. They've been divided up there, and if you go even farther toward Genesee and the Tennessee River and Buffalo there, you can see not even settled really in any sort of way at all. Really sort of empty sort of map. And over the next sort of 30 years, a couple of big changes helps to transform that state. First of all, the Indians are dispossessed. The mighty Iroquois Confederation that had been a major player in 17th and 18th century politics were sort of lost, dispossessed, driven into reservations. You also had one of the greatest public works projects in American history, and certainly by leaps and bounds the greatest yet before that. Coming from Massachusetts, we have the Big Dig, which is now officially the most expensive public works project ever in America. The Big Dig is nothing in comparison to this. This is the Erie Canal, as you know, living near here, enormous kind of thing. Thomas Jefferson, who, as you know, had this enormous worldwide sense of things, enormously big thinker. For him, even the Erie Canal was just beyond sort of belief. He called it madness. 363 miles of digging, 83 locks, 18 major aqueducts, all of which enormous kind of change, and helped to transform New York, making it sort of the place which brings people from the Atlantic out to the Great Lakes. And so by 1822, when we have another map that here, you can get a sense of the way in which that western New York has become filled in, has become a center of population. And so by 1820 or so, New York is the second largest population in the country, close behind Pennsylvania, and by 1830, the largest state in the Union, the most populous state in the Union. Masonry at this same time is growing even faster than this. Here is the frontispiece of a Masonic songbook from the 18 teens. Enormously successful, enormously popular. I think more subscriptions, more advance orders, I guess we'd say today, more advance order than any other book that I know about in this period. And this attempted to bring together a list of all the lodges in America. And it notes about 700 in the entire country. Pennsylvania, which as we know is still the most populous state, has about 72 lodges. New York has 158, more than twice as many. 1/3 more than the next state, 1/5 of all the lodges mentioned. But that's only the start to these major kind of changes, because the books listings were already out of date. In 1817, rather than 158, New York had 295 lodges. That's twice as many as the compiler thought in that 1816 book. And actually, for those of you who are Masonic leaders, I imagine many of you are, this is not just there were 295 lodges, there were 295 lodges who actually paid their dues, which was a big deal back then. And in 1817, even though you had 295, they also created 21 new lodges. So actually, more lodges created in New York that year than the book suggested were in all of New Hampshire. So this is a dramatic kind of shift, and a shift which is not just more Masons, but also a shift in the geography. Masonry continues to be popular in large cities in these years. In 1825, New York City has about 40 lodges. Huge number, dramatic number, but about 90% of the state's lodges are outside of the city. So you have nearly 500 lodges, over 450 of them outside of the small towns in the villages. So growth is really important. But now I want to suggest to you that this is not just growth in itself. This is not just having more Masons, not just more Masons in more places, but this is Masonry meaning something different. So this is not just quantitative change, this is qualitative change. And I've written especially in my book, extensively about these kind of changes, the way in which Freemasonry after the Revolution helps people deal with their lives, helps to create a sense of Republican values, helps to ease their personal transitions, to create economic relationships, to encourage people to charity, all sorts of things. And I think, and I brought to you the one of my favorite images from this period, the Freemason's heart. From these years, the Freemason's heart supported by liberty and justice. A sign of the larger meaning of Freemasonry for the Americans in these years. But I haven't emphasized in my early work how much some of the most distinctive changes in these years seems to have been centered in New York. You can sort of see New York, in fact, as a kind of Masonic hothouse in these years, sort of like California was in the 1960s and 1970s, a place where things are changing dramatically, where people are learning, are watching from outside and learning new kinds of ways and things. And these changes, in some ways, can seem like sort of exotic flowers, things which can't exist outside of the greenhouse, but actually they turn out to be really sort of hardy, that thrive outside of those areas. So I want to talk to you about several of those things. And here I'm sort of talking about the area, the band extending sort of from Albany to Buffalo, the Erie Canal route, both south and north of that a little bit. And the first of these big changes, first couple of these in fact, take place in Albany, which is becoming the capital of the Empire State. But the key figure here is one Thomas Smith Webb. And here we have an engraving of a portrait of him in the 1800s, the first decade of the 18th century. But while he looks quite impressive here, he's actually a man born in 1771, just before the Revolution, in Boston, to a sort of middling family. Probably somebody born in the North End, somebody near Paul Revere, but whose father was a bookbinder or bookseller who could only send his son to get to some sort of education, some sort of elementary education, and then eventually Latin school, which is a little bit a higher level kind of secondary education. Webb goes on to apprentice with his father and finds a difficult time establishing himself. Moves to New Hampshire at age 19, goes back to Boston, and then moves to Hartford, all in a very short amount of time, trying to figure out what he's going to do. It's in Hartford that he gets started in the printing of wallpaper. You don't think of printing, but actually used rather large blocks that would sort of be pressed onto large sheets of paper to make wallpaper. But in 1793, Webb, who's already a Mason, moves to Albany. And he only spends 6 years there. But those 6 years are some of the most important of his Masonic life. He creates this wallpaper factory, establishes a bookstore that has a lending library as well. But in those 6 years, he has enormous impact upon the American fraternity. In 1797, while he's there, he publishes the Freemasons' Monitor. The Freemasons' Monitor, the public portions of Masonic rituals that would be increasingly, because of Webb's activities, be regulated and regularized. He draws upon changes which occur in late 18th century England, but he makes Americans now pay attention to rituals, trying to make sure that the rituals they perform in one lodge exist in other lodges. If everybody does this, and not only that you have consistency there, but also within the lodge, that every member of the lodge would memorize the rituals and be able to prepare to talk about them and prepare to speak them accurately. And so I brought to you today one of Webb's most famous songs, because Webb is not only an active Freemason, a ritualist, he is also very heavily involved in music in this period. And after he moved from Albany, He moves to Providence, and eventually by the 18 teens into Boston, where he is one of the key founders in the Handel and Haydn Society. That is the musical group which still exists today, and which actually creates the American premieres of numerous kind of works. Handel's Messiah, in fact, was first performed in Boston by the Handel and Haydn Society. And I'm not sure if Webb was actually the conductor on that date. It's something I need to look up about that. But this is the master's song which he wrote there. And I'm going to, if you'll indulge me a little bit, I'm going to sing to you the first verse of this song. I should note this is for demonstration purposes only, academic purposes. Any aesthetic pleasure you get from it, purely coincidental and probably unlikely at this point. So, I sing the Mason's glory, whose prying mind doth burn, unto complete perfection her mysteries to learn. Not those who visit lodges to eat and drink their fill, not those who at our meetings hear lectures against their will, but only those whose pleasure at every lodge can be to improve themselves by lectures in glorious Masonry. Hail glorious Masonry! Hail glorious Masonry! To improve themselves by lectures in glorious Masonry. Thank you. And as a college professor, I have to say, any song that celebrates lectures has this kind of gratifying nature. Not a large genre that I know of. But I guess as a professor, I'm also compelled to admit that lectures here is not exactly the same as a lecture today. In some ways, it's more like a catechism, where the leader would ask a question, and the members would be expected to respond with sort of a set response there. And that gives you a sense that the prying mind, you're burning to learn more about Masonic rituals. That lectures are the center of things. That's the big change we're talking about here. Webb is also important for the spread of higher degrees, the spread of degrees which went beyond the sort of the first 3 degrees. The entered apprentice, the fellow craft, the master mason, and these have been part of Masonry right from the beginning. And expansion had been part right from the beginning. The Royal Arch degree is part of this rival large, the rival organization that comes to be known as the Ancients. But Webb is more than anybody else the man who brings these to America. In 1797, the same year he's publishing the Freemasons Monitor, he is providing over a convention that leads to the national organization of Royal Arch Masonry, the rise of the General Grand Chapter. And it's his constitution, a constitution written by a committee that he heads, that becomes the constitution for that national organization. And he helps to regularize these ceremonies and to encourage them as well to make them larger and more significant than ever. This is this 1816 Masonic minstrel frontispiece. I think is a wonderful example of things. You get the sense of here you have the Solomon's Temple up here, you have the arch, the Royal Arch underneath, you have Jerusalem in the background, suggestive of the significance of these new kind of degrees. And Webb also writes, and I'm going to spare you, the Most Excellent Masters song as well, which is part of the series of degrees that leads up to the Royal Arch. But it ends during a song which celebrates, as the degree does, the ending of the building of Solomon's Temple, and this song ends with a call to God to come down and to fill the temple. But of course, within the ritual, it is the lodge itself which is the temple. So the song goes, Almighty Jehovah, Descend now and fill this lodge with thy glory, our hearts with goodwill. So Masonry, again, becoming more and more significant, more and more powerful. Webb also helps to encourage the Royal Arch Masonry. You can see the man being lowered down through that Royal Arch there to find what is called the Grand Omnific Royal Arch Word, which is about the name of the deity, the name of God, discovering the books of the Pentateuch, the Torah there, which had been hidden, lost for so many years. There's so extraordinary series of changes that Webb is helping to develop, and it seems to be New York where these things change and develop more than anybody else. By 1825, you have 500 lodges. You have about 125 groups which are spreading the Royal Arch, almost one for every 4 lodges. And so as you can see from my description, Webb is helping to create within the lodge a new sense of sacredness, a new sense of Masonry as being set apart. So I think it's not a surprise that the lodge that Webb helps to create is called Temple Lodge. And today we think of Masonic temples as being the normal term. It wasn't particularly all that common before this period. And a key figure in this talk about the sacredness of Masonry is another upstate New York person, and that man is Salem Town. Salem Town, a college-educated man from Middlebury College, went on to become a minister and an educator, principal of a number of academies in upstate New York. A man who later on sort of develops considerable success as a textbook author. This is from the late 1830s or 1840s. Town's new school books. You can see the whole series of things, and his name's become like a brand name for these sort of things. But in his early years, he's probably more important for spreading new views of Masonry, because Salem Town is a key figure in this new Royal Arch organization, the Royal Arch chapter of New York, and he gives the annual address for many years, which, as the collection suggests, as you go down, was given in the chapter room in the city of Albany of Temple Chapter, which is Thomas Smith Webb's organization. And in 1818, as the title page suggests, these are collected and published, printed as a system of speculative masonry. And this is an extraordinary kind of book suggesting that Freemasonry is essentially religious and is essentially Christian. And he even expects in the future, when the millennium comes, when the world becomes perfect and ideal, that Masonry will be part of it as well. He talks about a happy Masonic millennial period. So an extraordinary series of changes here, all of these kind of centering within New York. But I think it's important to recognize, of course, that this isn't going to last. Freemasonry is still, despite this growing sense that Masonry is this sacred kind of activity, it's still deeply intertwined with people's everyday lives, with people trying to make their way in the world, establishing themselves, finding friends. And so in the end, Masonry is not able to sort of live up to this. In some ways, it's these same set of themes which is going to lead to the downfall of things. And so in some ways, a classic tragedy, I think, unfolds there. The sort of the great strength of post-revolutionary Masonry becomes its weaknesses. The great success leads people to become overconfident there. And so, ironically, as I suggested, it's a small event which upends this enormous success. A small figure, a small town as well. Morgan himself is not a major figure. He is born around the time of the Revolution, and eventually, and here I'll one of a couple of mentions of Canada here, so I apologize to you, but Morgan actually in the 1820s manages a brewery in what's now Toronto. Unfortunately, that brewery burns down. He's forced to go back. He's forced to go to upstate New York to try to find work, and he has a huge problem sort of walking around trying to find that. Eventually settles in Batavia, a relatively unremarkable town as well, except for this one. This is the Holland Land Office. This is the center of land sales in this area of upstate New York. But Batavia is not a major kind of figure. In fact, it is bypassed by the canal, that Grand Canal, which you can see snaking through the upper north of there. Batavia is south of there. You can get a better sense. Here's Genesee County there, with sort of the Niagara region off to the left there, and the Batavian sort of near the upper right center. You see Batavia pulled out there. And so Morgan is settling there, but he had not really attained the artisan's goal of setting up sort of a separate household. He is a man who still seems to shave with his landlord's mirror. And despite the fact we have a mirror here, talking about mirrors, it's difficult to get a clear image of this man, literally in some ways. We have, in I think 1829, we have the first publication, attempt to show who this man was, a portrait from William Bernard's Light on Freemasonry. This is a clearly an idealized thing. This is not a man who's going out and laying bricks. This is a man who is a great thinker, a statesman, a deep kind of man, an idealized kind of position. And so it's not surprising later on that Masons were kind of upset at this. Rob Morris, another great Mason, publishes two images in his book about William Morgan, calling both of which fictitious portraits. So you have the earlier one, and the one on the right you have something which I think he commissioned there to sort of suggest Morgan's not such a great guy. You have him sort of as a poor white sort of guy there. And since we know about his shaving, it's sort of odd that he has that scruffiness, but I think it's designed to show this is not a very trustworthy kind of guy. This guy who hangs around, you can see him hanging around the general store, grabbing drinks and things. And later on, as I suggested, Batavia, they create this thing, and you can see that they used the Bernard portrait from 1882 to create that sort of thing. But this is a man who's not enormously important, 50-year-old guy, average height, balding, a double chin, went away on September 11th wearing old and worn boots. So not a kind of figure. Almost everybody who knew him suggests, though, sort of two things about him. One is that he was a drinker. He indulged in drinking, which is fairly quite common. This is in the years before the temperance movement, but he doesn't seem to have been an alcoholic or a sort of regular drunk, but there. Also a kind of literate man, an interesting conversationalist. Even people who sort of oppose him suggest that. So this very sort of normal sort of man develops an ambition which is not particularly surprising in the larger sense of things, this ambition to publish Masonic rituals. Because there have been numerous exposés of Masonic rituals virtually from the beginning of Masonic rituals. And it's almost as soon as there were people deciding that Masons would do things, there were people deciding they were going to publish those things. I have here's Jachin and Boaz, the most famous early 19th century, late 18th century book. This is a Boston edition from around the turn of the century. And like many of these books, it's quite clear that the printers expected that Masons would want to use these. That Masons would buy these partly to learn these rituals. As the standard for performance grows, so does the attempt to provide ways to study up on these things. And so this book actually has a collection of songs here that can be used in lodges, which is not because people who aren't really Masons want to sing Masonic songs. It's because Masons want to have those things and they're using this. So it's not that odd that people are going to publish this. And Morgan, in fact, doesn't seem to have a high-minded motive either to improve Masonry or to attack it. It seems to have been sort of a commercial project. And here we have, this is the second edition of his book, Illustrations of Masonry, which actually doesn't even have an original title. Illustrations of Masonry is a title from the late 18th century British version of things. So it's not enormously successful or creative sort of thing, but Morgan's plan is different. And different because of some of the changes in post-revolutionary Masonry we noted. Morgan, first of all, decides that he wants to publish not just the original 3 rituals, but the higher degree rituals as well. And it's that which, I think more than anything else, inflames Masons around that period. Masons who are part of that series of changes we talked about, people who are increasingly serious about rituals, who are increasingly have a sense that Freemasonry is sacred and powerful and highly significant. And so a Mason from the area who received his degree just about this time wrote later on, he said, "I thought if Morgan was guilty of such an outrage upon the laws of Masonry, it was just for him even to lose his life." So this growing sense that Masonry is being outraged by this. And as a result, the story I've told you already, a dramatic kind of thing, but really kind of small and thing, but eventually leading to the huge kind of changes, sets off a kind of anti-Masonic movement, which changes public opinion about Freemasonry, which leads to major political movements opposed to Freemasonry in public life and shuttering enormous numbers of lodges. Masons, in the States at least, often talk about this period as the dark period, because so many lodges were closed off here. You can get some sense of this. Here's an anti-Masonic apron, a publication from this period, suggesting the ways in which Freemasonry is this monster. You can see on the bottom left, this hydra-headed monster of many different sort of evils, which you have to cut off all of those heads in order to succeed there. Enormous kind of things. And it's this early kind of movement against Freemasonry which has enormous kind of impact on creating the new kind of world of the 1830s and 1840s. You can see here's Andrew Jackson fighting another hydra, the Bank of the United States and the Bank War. And fears of large institutions are central to Americans thinking about things. Fear about demon rum, about the slave power. Everywhere you have this kind of attack. But also help to create the rise of modern reform movements, pioneering the techniques that would become so important in attacking overuse of alcohol and attacking slavery as a result of these things. And so it's not surprising that all these come out of an area of upstate New York where so many of these things are rising around there, so many of these changes are occurring, what's known to historians as the burned over district, the place where the first women's rights convention met in Seneca Falls in the 1840s, the place where Mormonism was created and during these years as well. And I don't have time to tell you the story here. I can if I wish to, if you want to hear more about this. But after William Morgan was taken away, his widow, Lucinda Morgan, ended up marrying the landlord, the same guy with the mirror where Morgan shaved, within sort of 4 years later. And within 4 years later, they had both converted to Mormonism and moved out west, where amazingly Lucinda Morgan Harris would become Joseph Smith's first adult plural wife. So kind of extraordinary, suggests the ways in which upstate New York is the center of things. Now, having 33 seconds, I'm going to spend a little more time on that, but I want to finish up by talking about what this means for Freemasonry. Because this is a difficult series of events for Masons to think about and to deal with. This is an extraordinarily harsh experience for Freemasons and the fraternity, and Masons complain, I think rightly, in a lot of cases about the harshness which is shown to them, although I think as a historian I'm forced suggests that both sides were pretty unkind, that both sides kind of attacked and called names enormously. But I think it might be helpful to think about a modern sort of economic term, and that's the idea of Joseph Schumpeter, the idea of capitalism as creative destruction. That capitalism doesn't leave things the same, that it destroys things, but it makes new things. And I think there's something to that for anti-Masonry as well. First of all, fraternalism itself is helped enormously by anti-Masonry. That if it's Masonry that provides the sort of the example of how to do things, that provides the model for this great age of American fraternalism, it's anti-Masonry, which helps to spread it, which helps to bring all of these rituals that Morgan and other people published, which brings those to the public and allows them to learn about these things. This also helps to shape American Freemasonry. These higher degrees continue, and in the process of this sort of dark period, American Freemasonry adjusts to a more diverse and more democratic world, to a more restrained sort of view of fraternity's religious character, which is going to be more important in the 20th and 21st century. But let me end, if I can get the slides back up. There we go. Whoops. Is there any way to go back without too much? But I was just saying, as I was in Batavia a couple of days ago, looking for that great Morgan monument there, this huge sort of thing. Now we need to go further. This, you will, as I'm doing this, sort of recapitulate in your heads. Which I told you, and this is a marvelous sort of teaching device. Kind of extraordinary, of course. There it is. All right. Because I did want to show you this because it has sort of a visual kind of significance here. As I was looking for Morgan, I didn't realize he was on the corner there. So it's hidden behind a tree, even though it's that immense, really high thing. Sort of Morgan is now among the telephone wires, as a matter of fact. But one of the things I noticed was a Masonic gravestone there. And this is William Eddy, a man who dies in 1859. And I noticed as it went down, this is a man who dies at age 32. So he's part of is the age when people became Masons in the 19th century. And so this is a man who had been born in 1827, 1 year after William Morgan, 1 year after the start of the anti-Masonic movement. Yet, Masonry sort of sprung up again, and by the 1850s, he's putting a Masonic image on his gravestone. So it's sort of a sign of the continuing life of the fraternity, despite the kind of the great destructions and difficulties of the 1820s and 1830s. So thank you very much.